Okay, can we get the first picture up there? We're going to catch everybody up to speed. I know a lot of you have seen this before, but we, of course, start with creation, and then it says fall, that's Adam and Eve. Promise talks about the promise given to Abraham and Sarah. You know, we're moving from left to right. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, and you see Jacob, of course, has a big J on his chest. The promise continues. Jacob is also known as Israel. And Jacob had 12 sons, and they had families. And those 12 sons were known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's favorite son, anybody remember? Joseph. Joseph saved them from the famine by getting them into Egypt. And then we know that things didn't go well after that in Egypt. Pharaoh enslaved them, so God sent Moses, and you can see Moses there. He has a frog on his head, and sheep by his legs, and 10 commandments in his hands. Moses led them out of Egypt, wandered in the wilderness. Joshua, the first judge, who, as we know, were military heroes, one of them, and they helped conquer the promised land. The 12 tribes were united, and they wanted a king just like all the other nations had kings. So God relented and gave them Saul, first united king. That didn't work out too well. He was replaced by the favorite king, King David, and you see him there with a crown in his hand and a D on his chest. And David was the favorite. His son Solomon was the wisest and the richest. And you can see there we have people singing psalms. David's remembered for writing psalms. And wisdom, you have a little boy with a candle in his hand. So after Solomon, the kingdom fell apart. 10 tribes went to the north to form Israel. Well, they didn't go to the north, it was split, north and south. 10 tribes in the north for Israel, 2 tribes in the south for Judah. And Israel is known for wicked kings. Wicked meaning they did not follow the way of the Lord. And today we get the next, that is where we are today, Elijah, in the time of the prophets. The prophets would come and speak to the kings, sometimes words that they wanted to hear, sometimes words that they didn't want to hear. Today, it was about the things they didn't want to hear. The king that was at Elijah's time was King Ahab. If you looked him up in history, he would be a very powerful king. If you look him up in the Bible, he is an evil king. He did worship Yahweh. That wasn't the problem. He was married to Jezebel, who was probably the most wicked woman in the Bible. Jezebel worshipped the Baals. The Baals were fertility gods. You wanted your crops to grow, you wanted your animals to multiply. They believed in worshiping those gods. What Ahab did is, yes, he worshipped Yahweh, the true God, but he also worshipped the Baals. He also worshipped Asherah. And they call that syncretism. He mixed it all together. The thing that broke the camel's back and why God sent Elijah was that they sacrificed 2 children on the altar. So today we have, God sent Elijah, and we don't need that screen anymore. God sent Elijah, and we have those 3 stories. I don't know if you realize it was 3 stories. First, the word of the Lord came to Elijah that there would be a drought. And after a while, there was a drought, and the food was drying up. And so God provided for Elijah by sending him to the Wadi. Wadi is a plain with water. And he provided for him there, but he didn't, the provisions weren't as good as the Trump Hotel. Do you have that picture? The accommodations weren't quite that nice. Instead of bellboys, God provided ravens to bring the food. Now, Elijah's people considered ravens to be unclean. So these disgusting birds were going to bring food and meat in morning and evening. Now, we feed the birds, right? Birds don't feed us, but in this case, the birds fed Elijah. You just kind of hope, imagine that if you were relying on birds to feed you, and you would hope that the squirrels didn't get first. But regardless, God provided for Elijah. Now, in the second story, what happened was, we don't need Mr. Trump's thing there anymore. The Wadi dried up. And so God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, a poor widow who had been affected by the drought like everybody else. And God sent him to this suffering widow. And I always like this story because it just sounds nasty. I like it because it sounds nasty. He goes to the widow. She says, I only have a little bit. We're going to eat it. We're going to die. And he says, okay, that's fine, but first bring me a little bit. Now, he does promise that God would provide for them. But you wonder, was she really believing that? I mean, she did provide. She gave him food. But did she really believe it? People that are suffering, through a drought, through a flood, through a tornado. I remember we did a servant trip down in Biloxi, Mississippi, after the Katrina, I think it was. And one of the complaints from the people we worked with was, those people aren't doing anything. Well, that's because they are so depressed that they've just lost hope. They don't care anymore. And you wonder if that's where she was, or whether she believed in the Lord. Now, I'm not sure. I don't really think she believed, because in our next story, the meal did not, God promised that the jar of meal would not run out and the jar of oil would not run out, and it didn't. But then the woman's son dies. And she thought God did it. She thought maybe it was something that she did. And we hear this even today. Tragedies hit people and people say, what did I do to deserve this? And even Elijah, you got to think about Elijah. Elijah must be like, God, what are you doing to me here? I'm living with this woman and she dies. It's only after God works that miracle that the woman says, yeah, now I believe that you are a prophet. Now, Elijah's struggles don't end here. Even though he's faithful, he has struggles. But God does not abandon him. God walks with him. Elijah's mission was to speak against the religious practices of the king, which is never a good thing to do if you want to save your life. But he did it. Now, today marks the 499th year that we celebrate or remember the Reformation, where Martin Luther, a German monk, not the African-American civil rights leader, Martin Luther was on a mission to speak against the religious practices of the church. And that started the Reformation. Now, things didn't go well for Luther either. He didn't have to eat raven food, and he didn't have to ask widows to support him. But the very church that he hoped to reform and help threatened his very life. I think there's at least two things that we learn here. God uses people to do good in this world. And what a privilege that is, right? God uses people like Elijah, like Luther, like you, like me, to do good in this world. Now, while we are faithful, things might not always go easily for us. We might not always be comfortable. But God doesn't leave us to fend for ourselves. God walks with us. We're beginning a stewardship drive today. During the stewardship, we're exploring how we best manage the gifts and blessings that God has honored us with. We're challenged to be faithful to God's calling. And don't you think if God is calling you to mission to help other people, that God will not abandon you and that God will be with you? You might not always be comfortable. It might not always be easy, but God will stick with you. My prayer today is that God will provide for you in good times and in bad, in challenging times, and that God will open all of our eyes to the blessings and the opportunities that He provides for us for the good of the world. And all God's people said, Amen.